We have a special, what we call in New Orleans, a lagniappe lecture, where Alvin Markle III, sitting right here immediately to my left, wanted to make himself available to chat with those who wanted to hear, even if we're all tired after a long day, after a long journey. But the program's going to be Cappy Markle, Alvin's son, who will give a brief background for about 10 minutes on Alvin's experiences, put it in context, and then pass it over to his father, who will be able to share his story directly with you all. And then we'll do some Q&A. We do want to end this at the 1 hour mark so that you all can get to dinner and then come back for the 8:30 program. So without further ado, here is Alvin Cappy Markle.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Eyewitness to Operation Cobra, setting the record straight. Welcome. Thank you very much for coming. I want to thank the vets for their service and this opportunity for my father and myself to give this talk on Operation Cobra with such wonderful vets in the audience and history lovers too. This is an important military battle in which my father was a participant, an eyewitness, and I know you want to hear from him. But as you know, we've been through some strenuous days, and Dad has a scratchy throat, so I'm going to start giving you the background, the Cobra plan, the military situation, and the historical accounts. And then I'll introduce now Lieutenant Colonel Alvin Markle III, who is then a captain and headquarters commandant of the 266th Field Artillery Battalion of 240 millimeter howitzers. And he will give his eyewitness observations, and then we'll try to come to some conclusions. The journalist Ernie Pyle was present at Cobra and was almost killed by the friendly fire incident on the second day. He later wrote, and I quote, "I have a hunch that July 25th of the year 1944 will be one of the great historic pinnacles of this war. It was the day we began a mighty surge out of our confined Normandy spaces, the day we stopped calling our area the beachhead, and that we knew we were fighting a war across the whole expanse of France." Pyle was right. What was the military situation before Operation Cobra? As you probably all know, Overlord had the invasion on D-Day on June 6th, which you've all heard a lot about. Operation Goodwood sent 6 British and Canadian divisions under Montgomery against Caen. But without reiterating the obvious, here we have Utah, Omaha, and this shows the front line on July 2nd, 26 days after D-Day. Let me point out, this line, this black line here, if you look up here, this shows you, this is 10 miles. This is 10 miles on that. So you can immediately see that in some points they hadn't gone 5. Maybe they gone 8. Here maybe 12, maybe 10, 2 or 3. And of course when they had this, they'd gone much further. The point being, for 26 days it had been very, very hard going. And there was the risk that fighting in this bocage, and as you've been told, you have these stone hedges that were so strong the tanks would ride up on them instead of through them, that we were facing trench warfare if we couldn't break out. The plan to break out, formulated by General Omar Bradley and General Joe Lawton Collins of the 7th Corps, came up with a plan to do saturation bombing in front of an area of the 7th Corps that they called the carpet. It was going to be 3.5 miles by 1.5 miles deep, a total of 5.25 square miles. They called it Cobra because behind the normal 3 corps, 3 divisions in every corps, were going to be an additional 3 divisions. So this corps had 6 divisions in it. Now, at what point could they put this plan into effect? They had to capture San Lo. They didn't want to leave it in a situation where they could have snipers or German observation posts in the city. So they had to take San Lo, and then they wanted to get up. They wanted to get further, but they were aiming to get to what was called the San Lo-Perrier Road. This plan was approved by Air Chief Marshal Sir Traford Lee Mallory and the Army Air Corps. It was made possible because we had command of the air. The carpet was going to be marked by red smoke, colored cloth, and this was going to be the first tactical use of strategic air. They were going to bomb 11,000 bombs per square mile. And I said this is 5¼ square miles. That's about one for every tennis court in the area. This would not include the RAF because they wanted to use lighter bombs than 500-pound bombs, 100 and 200-pound bombs, because they didn't want deep craters. The plan was that fighter bombers would fly parallel and close to the road, followed by heavier than medium bombers also flying parallel to that road as a guide for the 2,246 bombers, almost every American bomber we had in England. This is a picture taken during World War II of the bocage. I don't need to elaborate for this audience about that. So let me explain. Whoops, he didn't mean to do that. Here's the carpet area in front of the 7th Corps. Here's San Lo, and the plan was that what Collins thought and Bradley was that the planes would come down from over the channel, come south, hit San Lo, turn and go parallel to this road here. Here's Perrier, and that the road would be visible for a long distance. The Air Force wanted the Army to pull back 3,000 yards. That's almost 2 miles. They didn't. These hedgerows had meant that you were hitting a rock fortress every 50, 100, 150 yards. So pulling back even 1,000 yards was very painful to the Army. They ended up pulling back less than half of that. And then after the strategic bombing was over, then the first 3 divisions would go through with the 2 flanking out, and once successfully, then they were going to be followed by 2 infantry mechanized divisions and an armored division to punch through. So what was the situation on July 24th and July 25th? Oh, get my buttons correct. All right. Here is the front line. There. This is the American line. Here. And here's San Lo. I don't know if the color comes up. After the bombing that afternoon, the Army was only able to get this far. It didn't even get all the way through the carpet. The Germans put up greater resistance than they expected because they'd been used to going underground. Then Collins decided to go ahead with the plan anyway, and they're more successful. They punch through. I don't know if you can tell if they're green lines, but they get as far as the green lines on the second day, and then the third, they actually break out and come down here. And you can tell this is, I believe that's 5 miles. That's 4 miles. So you can see that's hard-won territory. But here, as you can see, they're making 8, 12 miles finally. Some things that are important to note, that prior to this, there'd been no practice and no procedures on using strategic bombing with the Army. This was the very first time. There had been strategic bombing on the Normandy beaches, but Collins and Bradley knew that it was ineffective, and I guess you now know too. They had knocked out hardly any of the fortifications and had not created the craters on the beach that had been counted on to give our infantry places to seek cover. So Bradley and Collins didn't have a lot of faith in strategic bombing, let alone that was the basis of their plan. Also, since D-Day, England was being rocketed with V-1 rockets, and later, of course, they'd be rocketed by V-2s. Operation Cobra was very risky because they were really going out without flank protection except close by. Fortunately, there were 3 things that occurred shortly before Cobra that helped. The first was the timely development of communication between tanks and the Air Force by putting Air Force airmen in lead tanks so they could communicate. Secondly, there was communication between infantry and the tanks by putting wired radios on the back of tanks so they could, in effect, see what the infantry could see. And as we've heard many times, the development of Sergeant Collins' Rhino device to stick into the bottom of the hedgerows so that the tanks didn't rise up and expose their bellies but would punch through, leaving a path for the infantry or other tanks to follow. Incidentally, in that 1 week before Cobra, Collins got 60% of his tanks welded with those, let's call them teeth. But the plan went awry. There were weather delays of 3 days. On July 24th, the go-ahead was given. But after they started off, they called it off, but 400 heavies had gone beyond the radio range and kept on going. They flew what I call it perpendicular. It's very important that you understand. When I talk about perpendicular, that means coming down across over the infantry and bombing into the carpet. Some fell short, and 25 were killed and 131 were wounded. Well, then again, on July 25th, there was another bombing where 111 were killed and 490, including General McNair, the highest ranking officer killed during the entire war. As I've mentioned, they found it harder going than they expected. As you can imagine, because of these friendly fire incidences, the Army was very unhappy with the Air Corps. Now, how have historians looked at these events? I've read 11 books on the subject, which is by no means all of them. And there are too many to summarize here, but I'm going to discuss 2. The first is Omar Bradley's memoir, A Soldier's Story. And many other historians have relied on his account. It was written in 1951, and he relates that on the 24th, the first day, he was, quote, told a box of heavies tripped its bombs through the cloud cover on the target. They had fallen short on the 30th Division, more than a mile behind the carpet, end quote. His G3 explained that the planes, quote, came in on a perpendicular course. And the explanation was that the Air Force thought it would take too long to fly through the narrow through the narrow end of the box. so they didn't fly the way Collins and Bradley had expected. But Bradley and Collins were forced to consent to them flying the same way the second day, because otherwise the Air Force wanted much more time to replan everything. The miscommunication was blamed on the error, especially Lee Mallory's leaving the key planning meeting before it was completed. On the next day, July 25th, Bradley writes that the casualty reports started coming in, and I said, "Not another short drop," end quote. But he gave no further details. He had a feeling that evening that Cobra was a failure. But he later realized, quote, "It struck a more deadly blow than any of us dared imagine," end quote. Now, the second book I want to discuss is written by Ernie Pyle, the journalist I quoted earlier. He wrote Brave Men in 1943 and had a 10th printing by 1945. And he described his experience being in the front of Cobra on the 25th with the 4th Infantry Division, he claims about 800 miles back from the kickoff line. And he describes how the dive bombers, the first was supposed to be the dive bombers before the mediums and heavies, came one right after the other. The heavies came from directly behind us in a constant procession. The first huge flight passed directly overhead and others followed. We leaned far back to look straight up. As the bombs came, the ack-ack started, and then, quote, "The windrows of exploding bombs were easing back towards us instead of gradually forward as the plan called for. The smoke line was drifting back over us, and then the bombs fell around us. He hid in a shed. When it relented, he came out, and, quote, "As far as we could see, other waves were approaching from behind, almost directly overhead, some striking half a mile behind us. But it must be remembered that he was on ground level, and with these hedgerows, with the trees in the hedgerows, his visibility was obstructed, as well as by the dust and smoke of the explosions and bombs. In spite of the casualties, the companies that had not been injured started the breakout on time." Another author, John J. Sullivan, wrote an article in March of 1968 for Parameters, the Journal of the U.S. Army War College, entitled "The Botched Air Support of Operation Cobra." Now, this attributes the friendly fire incidents to several things, including chain of command problems, ground commanders' lack of familiarity with the application of air power, Bradley's plan, which the Air Force took so as to fly perpendicular, otherwise it would force too many bombers into too small a space in the short time allotted, the use of fighter bombers to first glide bombing a strip along the nearest 250 yards to the road, concealing much of it, with the dust, of course, and later high-altitude bombers. Ike's misplaced loyalty to the British General Lee Mallory, whom many thought incompetent, and Bradley's 1 mile versus 2 mile buffer, and other numerous factors. However, he wrote that the order for Cobra left the route and altitude to be determined. That means by the Air Corps, implying perpendicular. The 8th Air Corps was commanded by General Jimmy Doolittle. In 1997, Gerald Astor wrote, quote, "The mighty 8th, the air war in Europe," and was told by the men who fought it. One he quoted to Herb Schenker, who described how using cluster bombs caused the opportunity for error because the plane's wash scattered them, including 3 that bounced off his own plane. Several witnesses referred to the dust and the wind, and Manny Abrams reported that there was not a cloud in the sky, and their run was at 10,000 feet, not the usual 20 to 25,000 or even higher for strategic bombing. Because as you know, strategic bombing is airfields, railroad yards, big storage facilities, and so on. So the historical accounts are rather lacking in eyewitness versions, except for Ernie Pyle's, and rely a lot on Bradley's memoirs, skipping a lot of detail, and depending a lot on references to bombs falling short, which is an artillery term. Dad and I are both artillery guys. And unfortunately, even in large lots, as they determine and they do the testing on every lot of the powder and of the projectiles and so on, there are some that don't go the required distance, and it's referred to as falling short. It had never been used before to apply to strategic bombing. Obviously, A, because this was the first time, and B, bombers can come from any direction, unlike the artillery, which is usually behind you. And now it is my pleasure to introduce my father, Alvin Markle III, who served through 5 campaigns and was awarded the Croix de Guerre and was made a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor.
Bonsoir. Good evening. Thank you for coming. At the time of the breakout from the Normandy beachhead, I was a field artillery captain, commanding headquarters battery of the 266th Field Artillery Battalion, a separate heavy artillery unit assigned to the 1st United States Army. It was armed with 6 240 millimeter howitzers, from which 112 pounds of gunpowder cast a 260-pound high explosive projectile up to 15 miles with deadly accuracy and devastating effect. After the landings, the Allied armies had made very slow progress and suffered many casualties because of the extensive swamps and stubbornly defended hedgerows. I saw on a division situation map that there was a range of low hills just south of the bocage on which the Germans had prepared mortar pits, machine gun nests, dug-in tanks, and other weapons. And I asked myself, if the bocage was so difficult, how could we ever crack the more formidable defenses ahead? General Bradley's answer was Operation Cobra. We were told that it involved saturation bombing of a square mile, but we had no idea where or when. On July 16th, I moved headquarters to a small wood in the center of the American zone, near the village of Saint Andre de Beaumont, just north of a large swamp and south of hedgerows, where there was an exceptionally tall lone pine on top of which the Germans had built a platform which was more than 20 feet above any other point in the beachhead. This observation post provided 360-degree unobstructed observation, with 5.5 miles to the hills in the south, 15 miles west of the Gulf of St. Malo, 10 miles north to the English Channel, and 39 miles east to Caen. We were unaware of the aborted high-altitude bombing on July 24th. They must have gone right over us. But the weather was bad and they flew above 20,000 feet. Word of the heavy casualties inflicted on our troops below spread widely through informal grapevine communications. On July 25th, I was on the observation platform with my radio operator, Sergeant Elvio Duran. The weather was clear, cool, and calm. At about 10 o'clock in the morning, I was amazed to see a single file of bombers approaching from the north at a low altitude. One after another, they passed about 6 miles to our east. As they approached Saint-Lô, each one turned right roughly 90 degrees to a course parallel the Saint-Lô-Perrier Highway, and they began to drop their bomb loads along the length of the box. Most of these planes were medium B-25s and B-26s, but there were some heavy B-24s. Unfortunately, the Germans had emplaced 88 millimeter high-velocity anti-aircraft guns behind the hills. Our low planes on a fixed track were an easy target, and I saw dozens of our mediums shot down. The heavies, though hit, were resilient, and all, in my view, kept on flying. The thousands of bombs and the dust and dirt they threw up created a huge dark cloud over the target area, which obliterated all landmarks. We could no longer see the hills. The later planes could not see the ground, but the cloud was obvious, and the planes confidently dropped their bombs into the cloud. No one was aware that an imperceptible breeze from the south had gradually moved the cloud north, coming over our troops, and the bombs fell on our infantry again. And again there were heavy casualties, despite the courageous parallel approach. Many historians have assumed that the casualties on the 25th were a repeat of the stubbornness displayed on the 24th, when the Air Force insisted on the perpendicular approach. I bear witness to the fact that the 8th Air Force flew courageously and complied with General Bradley's request for the parallel approach. Operation Cobra proved to be an outstanding success. It demoralized the enemy, destroyed his defenses, and enabled General Collins to decisively open a static battlefield into one of maneuver. The 7th Corps made the breakout. How can the shift from the standard operating procedure, high altitude perpendicular approach, to the low altitude parallel approach be explained? The high altitude standard strategy was ordered by Air Marshal Lee Mallory, General Eisenhower's deputy for air, who was not admired by our Air Force. The 8th Air Force was commanded by Lieutenant General James Harold Doolittle. Jimmy Doolittle was a national hero. He had led the bombing of Tokyo, a recipient of the Medal of Honor who had risen by merit to high command. I believe that when Jimmy Doolittle learned of the casualties on the 24th, he took it upon himself to order Bradley's parallel bombing, which I observed. It was nature that moved that cloud, unanticipated and unseen and resulted in the casualties. I thank you and will be happy to answer any questions.
During this time, was your battery
It's coming.
during this time, was your battery actively firing in support of the infantry?
No. We would love to have fired counter battery against the 88s, but one, we didn't know where they were, and two, these planes were flying so low that we didn't want to put our shells through their line of approach.
You mentioned that in the breakout, the various divisions moved very quickly, but the Germans had learned to live underground in that time. Did they clear those Germans out as they were moving, or did they bypass some of those strongholds and try to gain as much ground as they could?
Let me
The
answer.
research
Yeah,
that Cappy did will answer that.
Yeah, from what I've read, it seems that the bombing had substantially degraded what was in front of them, but they still were a formidable force. But it seems like it was a combination. They wiped out as many, you're talking about 3 divisions moving, then followed by 3 more in an area where the Germans had remnants of a division. So the answer is, others, I think, finished it off, but when 6 divisions went through that area, I suspected the Germans did right. I read how even those that weren't killed or injured were just so shell-shocked by this incredible bombing that, that they had trouble functioning. I know there's probably some other questions. So there's 3 points I'd like to make in addition. One was that Ike said after this he would never use strategic bombing again to assist tactical missions, and that after getting a free pass through the carpet and 35 miles beyond, General Patton started his Third Army at Avranches. I'm not sure I've Avranches, which is way down here, I believe, or further down. On August the 1st, in other words, 6 days after the breakout. And very fortunately, the German 15th Army with 18 divisions was kept by Hitler near the Pas de Calais because of Operations Fortitude and Ultra, involving the British double-crossing spies of the Germans. Ike had asked for only 2 days for keeping the Germans fooled. He got more than 7 weeks. And also, I'd like to posit a question for you. What if Cobra had failed? Daunting possibilities. Germany would have kept France except for the beachhead area. It would have kept rocketing England. Possibly England would have negotiated a truce, and/or Russia would have come through and taken all of Germany and France except for we had. Perhaps Germany could have developed its nuclear bomb or its jet planes to gain air superiority. Another possibility is that if Hitler had made peace with Russia, he could have invaded England. And as I said, if Russia defeated Germany and then even France, you would have had a communist Europe. And I think it's very clear that this was one of the key battles of World War II, in addition to D-Day, the Battle of Mortain, Battle of the Bulge, among others. And I'm so glad to be part of this, in which my dad participated. Are there any other questions?
Right down here.
Hi. Thank you so much for your service, and I'm so glad that we got back from our tour today in time to appreciate this lanyard that you've offered us. My father was injured in Guatemala, south of St. Lo, on August 10th, and he was born in 1918. What year were you born?
1918.
Oh, my goodness. Okay, and he was from Philadelphia, and he was part of the Clement family. And so I think there are so many interesting parallels here between you and my father. And yes, I can see that he wasn't able to, he'd been in the Army 4 years, but came in July, and then he was injured August 10th and was released from duty and sent back to the States. But as you said, all of this softening up of the enemy probably was a real turning point at that time. So thank you for your service and for telling us that story, and we're so glad to get to hear it from you.
Well, thank you for that comment, and thank you for being so thoughtful.
For those of you, for those of you who haven't done the math, that means Dad's 100, and in fact, in 5 days, on the 12th, will be 101. We fortunately have plenty of time for more questions, so there's one in the back.
Thank you very much. In terms of determining parallel versus perpendicular, do you think the Allies' experience on June 6 with the B-26s coming in parallel versus the B-17s coming in perpendicular might have influenced the decision at Cobra?
Well, the books I've read didn't discuss that. All I know is that Bradley and Collins were just very disappointed, as was, I think, the entire Army, with the lack of success of strategic bombing on the beaches and on the fortifications. So I don't really have an answer for you.
Well, that study from the staff, the Pentagon study, we learned a lesson. We learned that standards, SOP, strategic tactics did not work to support tactical operations. But air support has become very important to our ground forces. The Marines have their own Air Force. The Navy has their own Air Force. Regrettably, the Army does not have its own Air Force, and they depend upon units who are doing a mission that they feel is not as important as their strategic bomb. There is a plane in the Air Force known as the Warthog, and that's an ugly plane. But that was designed for ground support, and Air Force people learned to use it and use it well and effectively. Regrettably, in the more recent appropriations, the Air Force cut out the application for Warthogs. And as far as I know, at this moment, they have no plans to add to their ability to provide direct support to ground troops.
As a Vietnam vet, I can tell you that they were well appreciated. Of course, the Army does have helicopters and gunships, but and some Piper Cub type planes, but not an Air Force. Other questions? All right.
I was wondering, after the breakout, which was an incredible move, how did that affect the rest of the static line? Did it start moving the entire line then forward?
Actually, the First Army got through. The Second Army formed at Avranches and got off and running through France. And the Germans finally counterattacked with all their armor at a place called Mortain. That was more dangerous than the Bulge. At the Bulge, we had troops like Antwerp supporting the troops, our troops on the north of the Bulge, and we had troops from the beachhead supporting those south of the Bulge. And even though our army was separated, it was still supplied. If they had been successful at Mortain, we would have had two armies and no gasoline and no ammunition when they used up what they had. Fortunately, we were able to stop them at Mortain, and that was a better fight. The shell fragments covered the roads so that we had dozens of flat tires right away. The Germans, after they were stopped, started to pull back, and there was a fabulous opportunity to cut off these armored panzers. Now, the way that was planned was that there was a place called Falaise on the main supply route that they were retreating on. When you have two armies, friendly armies coming together, it's necessary to be extremely careful. We, Bradley, came up from the south and got to Falaise, but we couldn't go any further. We couldn't even shoot any further. We had to keep our fire within that line. General Montgomery had picked Falaise as the objective where we were to close the gap, but he didn't get there until most of the German army escaped with their tanks and units intact. And those were the same units who came at us again through the Ardennes. Next question.
There's one there.
Thank you for your service. Today we sit here in this comfortable place and comfortable time we're in, and we hear about friendly fire casualties, and you're horrified by friendly fire casualties. But it happens. War is hell. There isn't a lot of discussion about the civilians that are in the middle of friendly fire. But my real question is, I guess that was a statement rather than a question. My question is, have any of our armchair historians speculated on what would have happened from a casualty point of view had Operation Cobra not been performed and we had to fight through that area to get where we wanted to go.
I don't believe that that area was heavily populated. San Luis, of course, was a substantially large city, and when I saw it, it was flat. Chimney sticking up here, another one there. But San Luis was utterly destroyed. I hope that the civilian population fled. We had no way of warning them. And the resistance, we did our best to keep in touch with them. By the way, here in Cherbourg, the museum has a very good and thorough section where they tell about the relationships with the Vichy regime, the collaboration. They're very honest about what happened. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to get to that museum.
Tell them about how much, when you finally came through the carpet area, what you saw in terms of grass.
There wasn't any. Every square meter had a shell crater in it. They were not these huge craters that the 1,000-pound bombs made, because we wanted, that would have interfered with our armor. A tank can go over 200-pound craters, 100-pound craters, and smaller. But those big ones, they would bog down our armor.
I'd like to partially answer the question. As a Vietnam vet, of course, we're all familiar how in Vietnam there were what were called free fire areas. There, of course, you had the host country had an existing government and its own army, and it had its ability to tell civilians, to get out of areas, and those that didn't get out were presumed VC. But the American Army did not just declare, an area and start firing in it. More questions?
I'll bring it to the front section, folks. She'll get there quicker.
Thank you. Enjoyed the presentation. A couple quick questions. What day did you land in France? And two, was there not an official Army investigation of this incident? There was, 300 guys killed? So what was their conclusion?
We landed late in June, after the middle of June. The reason was that we were heavy artillery. With all that naval gun power from two navies, they had ample firepower, and they did need other things, more infantry, more tanks, more ammunition, more supplies. And everything was very carefully planned. Actually, we sat in Southampton in pyramidal tents, watching it pour down in rain and the barrage balloons swaying. We stayed there for 3 days before they could take us.
What was your second half?
The official investigation?
I'm trying to remember that piece. I think referred to one being done, but I don't think much came of it, because as you can probably appreciate, as soon as there was a breakout, all of your witnesses were now going hell-bent, as fast as they could away from the area. the wounded were being taken to ships, and the people at the higher headquarters, should we say, may have been ducking for cover, or, in other words, once, if I tend to agree with Dad's analysis, that it was probably General Doolittle who didn't want to fly over the Army, but his subordinates who obeyed those orders probably weren't anxious to brag that they had disobeyed Lee Mallory's orders after the event. So I don't have an answer about a real official accounting, but not much was done that I have come across in my readings.
Well, at that time, the idea was not to make sure that all the I's were dotted and so on. The objective was to get on with the war, and that was all we were thinking about. The administrative, the investigation, all that was not on our minds when we were involved.
Another little comment relating to the Vietnam War. I had 3 jobs: civilian action officer S5, civilian personnel officer, and legal officer. As a legal officer, I had countless little things to do besides special court-martials, and every guy who lost a camera, everyone who was filing a claim. So even back then in 1970, the Army was spending an immense amount of time on what most of us would have considered small stuff. Other questions?
If I may chime in for a bit and make my friend Bruce happy, somebody, I think Nick, may have referenced Exercise Tiger. This was not even real war. This was a training exercise, and more than twice as many people died in Exercise Tiger. And there's a theory that there was a cover-up. Well, nobody really wanted to talk about it, and it was covered up, so the Germans didn't know about it, but they had a war to fight. And those 800 men, God rest their souls, were not the important loss. It was the 3 LSTs. So 300 men on the bombing snafu was, it was the cost of doing business, I think. And you would know better than me, sir, because you were on the front lines, but we can investigate it or we can do the breakout. That's what the bombing was for.
As Napoleon said, if you want to make an omelet, you got to break eggs.
I think that's a great one to end it on. Cappy Markle, thank you, and Lieutenant Colonel Alvin Markle III. Thank you very much, sir.